Activists are kind of like entrepreneurs. They're very stubborn. They're very hard-headed. That is how they are able to change the world. Many of them balance that with an incredible humanity. A lot of them don't, though. I've spent hours with hundreds of different human rights activists from 50, 60, 70, 80, I don't know, maybe 100 countries, different backgrounds, different kinds of people. A lot of them are very narrowly focused on what matters to them, probably for good reason. A lot of these people have had their families tortured or whatever. A lot of them have strange attributes. I would say that's something to recognize. It's probably similar with CEOs and founders of companies. Some of them are going to be very humane, and the trait that I would imagine binds most of them is some sort of stubbornness or frustration with the way the world is, and a drive and a willingness to change.
Welcome to the Global Affair podcast, brought to you by Love Out Loud, the world's largest love-based movement actualizing a civilization of love by 2030. My name's Nicole Gibson, and join me and some of the world's brightest minds as we bring some of the most important and controversial conversations of our time into a space of unity. It's important to know that as your host, this isn't about my personal opinion or bias, but rather an opportunity to listen with love, honesty, curiosity, and reveal the true universal experience us humans have amongst the differences. So if you love the show, please let us know by giving us a rating and tell us how to make this conversation easier for other people to jump into as well. And with that, let's get it. Alex, thank you so much for being on the Love Out Loud podcast. To all the Love Out Louders out there listening to this podcast, Alex is a total badass when it comes to civil liberty, human rights, the evolution of our economy. And I'm super grateful for him jumping on with us this afternoon and sharing his incredible wisdom. Alex, welcome.
Thank you for the generous welcome. Happy to be here.
So in Love Out Loud, we're very much about scoping out new paradigm of possibility for humanity. You know, our bigger vision is to really truly be able to build systems and influence systematic change, which allows for more people to live in a love-based way and transcend oppression, fear, powerlessness. I would just love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you truly believe that's possible for humanity, for us to build an earth that is free of those violations of human rights.
I'm very optimistic. I think the world can be dramatically improved. However, I think it would be, based on what I've seen, naive to think that human rights violations can end completely, or that wars and conflict and greed and jealousy can end. I think what's more interesting is to consider a future that harnesses these bad traits within us and somehow channels them into basically nullifying them. Like a lot of the things I'm looking at right now relate to the idea of systems that take greed and jealousy and transform them into basically bettering others and improving the lives of other people and improving freedom for people. And I don't know how many technologies or social systems exist like this, but there's certainly one that I'd like to talk about that sort of does that. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I don't think that we can rely on altruism alone to improve our society or race. I think that's proven to be, unfortunately, not sufficient. There have to be incentives for people to want to improve. And I think those incentives have to align with self-interest, from what I've seen at least. So yeah, I guess we can start with that.
Such a powerful point of discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts based on the humanity that you've been exposed to and doing this work and formulating these views, what your understanding is of the essence of human nature.
My views are colored by the work I've done with the Human Rights Foundation and the Oslo Freedom Forum in meeting dissidents and investigative journalists and democracy leaders from around the world who are living in authoritarian countries. Look, I think generally speaking, over the last 2,000 years, many humans have decided to make a trade-off where they've basically managed to create a system where the idea of one or a small group of people in charge, which is traditionally how human societies operated, right? Hierarchical systems with a dictator or a tyrant or a king or whatever, emperor. That system despite its sort of dominance and sort of ease, has been traded off for a more decentralized system in many countries where there's like a balance of power and there's executive branch, a legislative branch, judicial branch. That trade-off has led to the empowerment of people and actually has been in the self-interest of those people. So like in a country that has made a transition from a dictatorship to a democracy, over time, we've seen super strong evidence that has benefited people in terms of their incomes, their lifespan, their quality of life, their literacy rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as you watched, especially in Europe, all of these military dictatorships and kingdoms turn into electoral democracies. And there's examples of this in every part of the world: Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, former Soviet Union. And it's not a rule, but it's generally true. It generally holds that as countries decentralize their political power, they become more prosperous. So I think that's an interesting concept and idea to dwell on. And we are seeing the decentralization of political power as maybe one of a set of three things that are happening, where also in the last several hundred years seen the decentralization of information through the printing press and all kinds of other technologies, and obviously most recently the open internet. So that in the same way that, again, like we've made this trade-off very unconsciously. It's not like somebody pressed a button. It's that over time, there's been a trade-off in exchanging the power that a small group of people once held over all the information, whether it was in the Western world's Christian authorities or religious authorities in Muslim world, etc., that held the keys to the library and controlled information. That's been exchanged for a system where anyone can immediately, with like click of a button, understand everything. And everybody has the Library of Alexandria in their pocket. So that's been like enormously democratizing. And then the third set, I would say, is with money and with Bitcoin. And that's where we're going to get to this idea of where small groups of people, again, held all the power, not in a political or an information sense, but in an economic sense. And now we're shifting to this world where like nobody in particular controls the Bitcoin system and we can all access it permissionlessly. No one can stop us. And no one person or group can change the rules. What's interesting to me is that like in each case, it's been a social exchange of, in some cases, maybe you would say stability and certainty with more of an autocratic system, towards something more risky and radical, but that has given enormous fruits to humanity. We've seen that borne out with democracy and the internet. We haven't seen it yet with Bitcoin, but I believe we're just at the beginning of that. And again, it's this interesting thing where like people realize that this transition, this decentralization process is good for them. So they get skin in the game and they get interested, and it's not altruistic. It's not altruistic to want your country to have a democracy. It will actually most likely make everybody's life better, including yours. It's not altruistic to want open information. It may be, but it's also going to make everybody able to do more. And I think with Bitcoin, we'll see the same. Like people are going to want to flock to Bitcoin for self-interest because they think it's going to make them money. But in the end, it's like strengthening the system that makes things more free and fair for everyone. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about.
I love what you're sharing. And a distinction that I find so interesting is that altruism has to sort of be separated from this idea of self-interest, when what you're actually sharing is this natural process of evolution that's happened across pretty much now all of our major systems to decentralize has actually improved the lives of the individual. Is it not pointing to, in your opinion, the fact that we really are better, more fulfilled when we are able to transcend just the idea of self and work with each other? It actually creates more prosperity for all.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that narrative has been co-opted actually by dictators. If you actually look at China and you look at the Chinese Communist Party, there's this strong message that we need to work together and that we need to be one as a nation and that we need to harmonize. And I think these narratives are really dangerous because it's about harmonization is just a code word for putting Muslims in giant concentration camps. It's very straightforward there. So I would be wary of any sort of like grand narratives or themes that call for everybody to come together and work. These sort of communist communitarian ideologies have traditionally ended very poorly for people. I guess what I'm getting at is that I think altruism and self-interest are different, but I think the trick is designing a system where self-interest creates altruism, where like you are forced to, because you want the best for yourself and your family, very narrowly, participate in a system which makes everybody better. And from my experience dealing with all these brutal political situations around the world, that's the only way I could have faith in a better future, is if we harness our worst parts inside of us. We can't expect them to improve. We're always going to live in a world, again, that I think has a lot of jealousy and greed and conflict. But if we can design systems where self-interest dictates peace and prosperity, then we win. That's at the end of the day what global trade is. If you think about the reasons why France and Germany aren't going to fight each other tomorrow, whereas over the span of 100 years, 30 years war, World War I, World War II, those two nations exterminated a third of each other's male population 3 times in the span of 100 years, millions and millions dead. That's not going to happen anymore, or at least the possibility of that happening is like super minuscule, because they are trading with each other and they are each benefiting from each other. However, it's not because of altruism. France and Germany aren't peaceful because they all of a sudden like each other better now. No, they're peaceful because they're locked in this system whereby they are reliant on each other. And this system is built on their self-interest and their selfishness and their greed and their individual, both state and nation, like citizen and sort of nation, self-interest. Like, it is better for France to trade with Germany. It results in more prosperity for the people and for the country than to fight. So again, that's like a clear example, I guess, to give you one of how I think this can work and actually benefit humanity.
I love this. Being able to really leverage our worst points and actually have them equal prosperity for all. That is, of course, an avenue that is something that I believe deserves everyone's backing. And I can't wait to sort of dive into more of your passion for Bitcoin and decentralized economy.
Yeah, but it doesn't always work like that. Again, it takes a special set of people to architect that design. I mean, you can have many other designs, and we can see that in the world today. China and North Korea is a good example. And these countries also aren't fighting each other, but it's not because they have this brilliantly designed system whereby the self-interest of each country is dictating that. On the contrary, it's a small group of people have managed to hold on to with violence each country. And they just narrowly have decided to not fight each other. But that, as we know, is fickle. That could change any day now. Whereas the long-term self-interest-based cooperation between nations is not fickle. It's very hard to change. It takes years to erode. Yes, far left or far right leaders could come into power in France and Germany and they could drive each other to war, but like that would take years and years to do. It would take 60 seconds or, several hours for the North Korean leader to say something that would piss off the Chinese leader. And all of a sudden, goodbye your subsidy, or worse, right? So what's additionally interesting about these systems, these social networks that bind us together out of self-interest, is that they're more anti-fragile and stronger than ones that are based on autocracy and centralization. We also should recognize that those centralized systems can and do work. And unfortunately, they are still about as popular as the decentralized ones. Out of today's 7.5 billion people, more than half live under an authoritarian model. You could look at a half glass full and say, oh, wow, almost half live under a free, more, open one. And then that's how I look at it. But still, I mean, it would be naive to say that the centralized model based on violence instead of on cooperation is for the past. It's clearly still part of the present, and it threatens the Chinese model. The Chinese Communist Party wants to rule the world, right? And while that may be more in the minds of perhaps Australians than most people, maybe in the rest of the Western societies, it's probably not going to happen for different reasons, but it's still something we should think about. There is this sort of existential civilizational threat here of, are we as a species, as a society, going to be ruled by dictators or by ourselves in the future? That's still an open question, I would say.
Can I ask, Alex, through all of your adventures, frontline tackling of these problems, how has it come to formulate your own personal philosophy about how you live your life, how you show up in the world? Have you needed to incentivize these sort of darker parts of your personality to show up in leadership in a more altruistic way?
I do think it is important to distinguish what happens in a family or a small organization from what may happen in a neighborhood or a town, from what may happen in a country, from what may happen for the all of humanity. I think there's some clever witticism that people in Silicon Valley say where it's something like, I'm not saying that I prescribe to this exactly, but you can think of it this way. You want to be like a communist with your family and friends, but a libertarian with everybody else. It's true in as much as you may have different personal philosophies dealing in generosities and willingness to forgive and things like that with a smaller group of people than with strangers. And I think this is just straight out philosophy. Like, you're going to be more sympathetic and empathetic with people you know than you don't. And a lot of what goes on at the Human Rights Foundation and my day job is trying to figure out how to make people sympathetic to something that's happening halfway around the world to which they have no good relation for, that they have no bloodline. They have no reason to care for what's happening in Nigeria right now if you live in California. So how do we get them to care? And that's the art of what we do at HRF. But in general, I think that people who are amazing, or at least if you read their autobiographies, right? Or you read their biographies, I guess more accurately, you want to definitely see like an independent.
That's distinction. Yeah.
Distinction. Yeah. But like they might be a tyrant in the office, but be like great at home or whatever. And their product may change the world, right? Or it might be the opposite. They might be amazing at home, but like not a particularly good at business or something like that. You'll see people differ. Like I'm someone who traditionally is conflict avoiding, and that's
in your nature.
It's not a good attribute actually, because it allows things to like simmer. And
how do you then write the strategy for the Human Rights Foundation?
So I'm differentiating between like my interpersonal relationships from I'm trying to tell you is that it's super different.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I mean, you could read somebody who, what's a good example? People are very different. They're like, it's like Jekyll and Hyde. Like you might read someone, they're describing a way of living and then they live a different way. For me at HRF, we're seeking conflict. We're like trying to expose and shame dictators. But like in my interpersonal relationships, I started at a place where I was like trying to avoid that.
So and I feel that's actually equipped you in a way to be able to understand what gets in the way of people wanting to lean into conflict and actually approach that strategy with more of a depth of understanding. Do you draw on that personal shortcoming?
I think it's important if you're trying to work with someone or if you need to spend time with them to try and figure out if they are one or the other. That'll help you unlock a better way of dealing with them. And that's something
in negotiations.
Could be someone that you've hired to do some work on your house, or it could be your boss. Or it could be someone that you are advising or someone that you gave birth to or whatever. I'm just saying it's probably a good idea to figure out whether or not they avoid conflict, because that'll really help you understand how to deal with them. And I didn't have a good understanding of how important that was for many years. And I think that's unfortunate. So I think that's certainly improved my ability to be, I think, more effective. Generally speaking, it's also easy to be like straightforward and petty sometimes if we're in a rush or whatever, or we're like really focused on something. And that's not an easy thing to undo. Well, it may be obvious to you or whatever, but
for sure. And how much
it's not obvious to me. So that's been also a big thing, is like be super careful about the way you say things.
Yeah. One thing I'm so passionate about is like people recognizing that the person you're being and embodying, whether that's personal or professional, there's always going to be a flow-on effect. I had a position as a commissioner in Australia advising the PM on the mental health portfolio. And what I learned during that time was these leaders who in their own lives were stressed and not regulated and not in any state to be making conscious decisions, especially to the degree that they were and the amount of lives that those decisions were impacting. It made me so passionate to think deeper about how the way that we're showing up personally and our own personality has to have a flow-on effect, irrespective of how professionally skilled we are, to the way that we're influencing change in a position of leadership. Have you seen this? Like how I'm sure you have, in some of the conflicts that you've been on the front line.
Yeah, I'm trying to describe general aspirational things that I, just based on what I've seen, recommend for people. So number one, try to understand if the people you're working with are conflict seeking or conflict avoiding. And number two, just pause and consider what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. Being brash doesn't usually help. Going back to the work I do, activists are kind of like entrepreneurs. They're very stubborn. They're very hard-headed. That is how they are able to change the world. Many of them balance that with an incredible humanity. A lot of them don't, though. I've spent, let's say, hours with hundreds of different human rights activists from 50, 60, 70, 80, I don't know, maybe 100 countries, different backgrounds, different kinds of people. They're not all like people that you'd enjoy spending time with. A lot of them are very narrowly focused on what matters to them, probably for good reason. A lot of these people have had their families tortured or whatever. A lot of them have strange attributes. I would say that's something to recognize. It's probably similar with CEOs and founders of companies. Some of them are going to be very humane, and you'll see great blog posts about how wonderful they are, but that's not possible to make in every case. And in fact, the trait that I would imagine binds most of them is some sort of stubbornness or frustration with the way the world is, and a drive and a willingness to change.
Do you feel like it's something that is an important message for people to understand, how often leaders aren't experiencing empathy in their positions? Like they're pedestaled and they're expected to be the embodiment of what it is they're speaking 24/7, and how actually that pressure can really be damaging to a leader.
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to please everybody. I wasn't really talking about political leaders, actually. I think that's a very different breed of people. But I was talking more like about human rights activists.
I think leaders in general experience that often, an absence of empathy, which then drives them to maybe be even more calcified.
Possibly. I do think that political and diplomatic leaders are much more self-serving. I mean, they often don't have a mission beyond
political
being in
agenda.
power. Okay. So if you're a tech CEO, your mission is not to be in power. It might be to make a lot of money, but more likely it's like because you figured something out and you really want to pursue that, right? Like Elon Musk is a good example. Like these things he's done to help change the world, they're like obviously things that it's not like he wants to be president. You know what I mean? He wants to pursue these things, which are wild and at the frontier of our imaginations. Same thing with human rights activists. If you went to school for human rights, chances are you're not going to be a very good human rights activist. Like human rights.
Isn't that like anything, Alex?
No, I think it's actually, if you went to school to be a good chemist, you'd probably be a pretty good chemist. This is different. You actually interview people who are the most famous dissidents. They went to school for something else and it happened to them. Right? So their father was kidnapped, or their sister or brother or mother or whatever. Something happened. A dictatorship or an extremist organization came and invaded their town or their region or their country. Most of these people I've interviewed or to know, they started out in a rock band or as a geologist or something like that, and they end up being a revolutionary leader. So I would say that a lot of what I've seen in human rights activism is happenstance. There's not decades of intentionality behind their decision. Whereas
it was responsive.
It's responsive. So I think I would want to differentiate qualities of leaders. In general terms, activists and technologists are responsive, whereas I think let's call them politicians, and then in dictatorships and authoritarian states, thugs, they're more power seeking. If you want to believe that the Chinese Communist Party is doing what they're doing for the good of the world, you can believe that. I don't. I think it's important to actually distinguish different kinds of leaders.
Yeah.
Because they have different motivations.
Definitely. Underneath all those leaders is a human being with their own complexities as well, which is, I think, a beautiful segue into talking, because I know you want to talk about Bitcoin, and we're so interested to hear as well how leaders sometimes need that incentive to be able to align their personal motives to a system that serves all. So I want to know what led you into your passion for Bitcoin. Was it your work through the Human Rights Foundation? What did you see? What experiences were pivotal in helping you recognize that we needed to rethink our economic structures and systems?
Sure. I think my interest in Bitcoin was built on my career in fighting authoritarianism and supporting dissidents and activists around the world. I came into it that way. I didn't come into it from finance or from trading or from tech. And maybe that's just why I see it differently. But to me, it's extremely powerful and breathtaking. It is something that most people just have not grasped yet. For me, given what I've seen in terms of the problems around the world, a money that can be sent without having to ask permission from anybody and that can't be censored and that isn't controlled by like rich people or billionaires or governments is tremendously powerful and very progressive. And it started out as nothing. It started out as concept paper. It started out as one person running the software on their computer. And now it's this unstoppable global force. It's really amazing, especially when you consider that we don't even know who created it. He, she, they, I just have no idea. And that's the only way really it could be. Because if someone created it very early on, they would have been arrested, killed, something like that. Something would have happened to them. And then in that early days, when you could have stopped Bitcoin, it would have been stopped. The anonymity, or rather, I guess the pseudonymity of the founder or founders, super, super important. It was the only way it was going to work. But now we have this, again, we have this money, we have this network, we have this way of coordinating with each other that does not rely on any government or any corporation or our oligarchy. Like just this morning, I made a donation of Bitcoin to a feminist organization in Nigeria that's organizing protests against police brutality. And I donated to their Bitcoin account from my phone in a matter of minutes, and no one's going to censor that transaction. It's not possible. And then they own it. They are the owners of that now. They have the private key to that. And that teleportation of value is incredible. So to me, that's just a very powerful thing that is going to be a very important tool for human rights activists, but probably much deeper and more transformative than that.
Incredible. So incredible. And for those who are listening that aren't overly familiar with blockchain technology, what are the biggest differentiating factors as we move from a centralized system into a decentralized system?
I know it seems weird to focus on this. I really would ask your listeners to consider that it's not exactly about blockchain technology is a marketing term. If you read the Bitcoin white paper, the word blockchain is not in it. Satoshi refers to something called a time chain. Blockchain was something that was invented later, and it has been co-opted into a term that seeks to replicate some of what is Bitcoin, but make it palatable for the masses and controllable. So blockchain technology is a corporate term, a government term. It's non-revolutionary and non-problematic. Bitcoin is the revolution.
To them.
Yeah, it's controllable. I mean, It's a system that's designed and can be controlled. It's just like another database. It's completely anodyne. There's not a whole lot to look at in the area of blockchain. You can ignore it completely. Bitcoin is the thing that I would urge your listeners to think about and learn about. Because again, to me, this is not a technology innovation. This is not a database innovation. This is, again, I think as big as the creation and distribution of information, and democratizing that. Bitcoin is a global money network that is not controlled by governments and corporations at all. There are other cryptocurrencies which will gain a lot of use and be very popular, but those cryptocurrencies are controlled in some way by governments or corporations. I'll give two examples. One would be a stable coin, and one would be what's called a CC, or central bank digital currency. So again, you have Bitcoin, which is this open source software project that is open to anybody. You don't need to prove an ID or disclose any information to set up a Bitcoin account, and nobody can stop you from sending value to somebody else. And it's scarce. There's just not that much Bitcoin. So therefore it's very valuable, and it'll become increasingly valuable as more and more people learn about it. Like the rules of the system are not controlled by a small group of people.
Do you feel like that will ever shift, Alex? That there would be more Bitcoin issue?
No, there will not. That happens, then that won't be Bitcoin. That'll be something else.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is scarcity at a fundamental level.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is 21 million. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And that is Bitcoin. If somehow that's changed, then it won't be Bitcoin. It'll be something else. So you have Bitcoin. I would say 3 things to pay attention to in the space of digital money in the future. With Bitcoin, you have stable coins, which are created by companies and software entrepreneurs, in which may be less controllable than like Venmo or PayPal, but ultimately are stable. Their value is somehow tied to a fiat currency. So at the end of the day, it's still under the auspices of a government. Do you see what I'm saying? A stable coin is only as good as the thing it's pegged to.
100%. Yeah.
So you can make a good argument that we should be looking at stable coins because they allow us to perhaps trade dollars or Australian dollars in a way that's like less controlled by the government. But at the end of the day, they're still Australian dollars. They're still replicas of the dollar.
So the Bitcoin really is its own currency.
Yeah, Bitcoin has nothing to do with the dollar. Its value proposition is not violence and guns. It's not. It's completely different. Yeah. So you have Bitcoin, you have stable coins, and then central bank digital currencies are very interesting. Basically, we've had digital money, meaning fiat money, for a long time, obviously. It had credit cards. And these are all ledger-based systems, right? Which are relationships between you and a company. And then that company has a relationship with a big bank. And then that bank has a relationship with a central bank. This is sort of modern finance, right? A government will issue liabilities in 2 forms: reserves, which it gives to commercial banks, and then cash, actual notes. These are liabilities of the central bank. And these are distributed to individuals out in the system, out in the wild. And they're good privacy tools, obviously. They're bearer instruments. Cash is cool. We like cash in the human rights space, or at least human rights activists should like cash. I'm rehashing an explanation of a monetary historian named Brett Scott. It's fabulous, and your listeners should all check out his videos. But he basically makes the case that there's just only a couple kinds of money. There's state money, call it fiat money. And again, that's either reserves, which are given to banks, or cash given to citizens. Then there's like commercial money. So these banks, based on how many reserves they have, can create different sized ledgers for their customers. So this is commercial money. This is like a separate kind of money. And then you have what he calls, I think, intermediaries. So these are like these tech companies like Stripe or PayPal or whatever. And they have their own ledger and they have their own money, and it's attached to a bank. So the thing to understand is that like the tech company money and the payment processor money, Visa, PayPal, Venmo, that's all in the end of the day, all those people have bank accounts and they're all connected in some way to that central government. So all of that stuff is what we call KYC, know your customer. Like it's basically, in order to use Visa or PayPal or have a bank account, you have to provide all of your information, which increasingly is like a scan of your face and God knows what. So in order to use commercial money or digital reserve money from the central bank, you have to prove your identity. These are not privacy tools. Okay. Cash is a privacy tool, but there's a war on cash. Cash is disappearing. It's, as everybody's probably aware, in 20 years, nobody's really going to use cash.
Is there less cash being printed at the moment, Alex?
Well, it depends. Obviously, in certain countries, yes. I think in China, yes. But in America, I think the amount of cash year on year remains, there's a slight growth. But in terms of percentage of transactions in a society, it goes down. So in America today, as of last year, 26% of daily American transactions, 26%. That obviously used to be way higher. Like 30 years ago, if you went out and bought a coffee, you weren't going to pay with a check. Credit cards weren't popular 40 years ago, whatever it was, right? There was a time when like cash was close to 100% of all daily transactions. And that meant privacy for everybody. There were no big brother systems vacuuming up all this transaction data because it didn't exist. Okay. So now that 74% of Americans' daily transactions are digital. And when I mean digital, I mean credit card or your phone or your swipe or your chip or whatever. That's just like a huge surveillance machine, right? And both commercial and state, both big brother and surveillance capitalism. So this is happening in different proportions in different countries. I'm not sure what the exact proportions are in Australia, but it's a general trend, right? towards a cashless society. And what Brett Scott and others are pointing out is that as this goes on, there's this like war on cash where governments don't like cash very much because it's hard for them to control and spy on people with. It's a privacy tool. So they'd rather have a digital equivalent. So that's where, again, these central bank digital currencies come in. If you will, 3 cryptocurrencies that your viewers should be aware of. 1 being Bitcoin, 2 being stable coins, and 3 being these central bank digital currencies. So the idea is that instead of giving you cash as a piece of paper, they'll give you cash in an app, and it'll be a direct liability of the central government. Now, this is good for them, for central governments, because A, it erodes power from the private sector, gives them more power. And number 2, it allows them to have like direct surveillance of where all this sort of daily money's going. So it takes this part of the economy that they don't have very much insight into, daily small transactions, and it makes that a clear window. So there's both a surveillance and like a power struggle reason why federal governments will want these things called CBDCs. And that's why they're going to try to replace cash with them. It may not work, but it's certainly something they're trying. The Chinese government just did its first ever big like rollout of this week, actually. So in Shenzhen, they dropped to 50,000 people there, about $30 worth each of this it's called DCEP. China's central bank digital currency is called DCEP. And they gave it to 50,000 individuals and 3,000 merchants. So they're like trying to jumpstart it. And as you saw with China, with like things like WeChat, they're able to jumpstart stuff pretty fast. Like it only takes a couple of years for stuff in China to go from like no users to like 600 million users. So look, we're dealing with a future where we're going to have these like potentially digital versions of state money or spy tools. Again, we may have private versions of money that may be less controlled by those governments, but at the end of the day are still pegged to the value. No way for a government to change the value. So that's why it's super interesting. And go back to the beginning of our conversation. It's why it is this like machine that sort of turns greed into freedom, because no one government can control its price. I predict like gold did or remains as this reserve asset that is somewhat scarce. And in Bitcoin's case, completely scarce. Gold, as more gold comes into circulation every year, a small amount, about 2%, but it's like, it's always growing, the amount of gold, whereas Bitcoin is growing only a small amount now, and that rate of growth decreases to 0 in year 2139. So as of that year, there'll be no more Bitcoin. So over the next 100 years, you'll see like a small amount of new Bitcoin come into the system, and it's asymptotic. So it's like after about 10 years from now, it'll be almost barely anything. But given how powerful Bitcoin is and how useful it is and how censorship resistant and seizure resistant it is, people like me believe that it'll be worth a huge amount in the future in terms of these state monies, which are the total opposite. State monies are infinitely printable. And indeed, you're seeing this new philosophy come to power and prominence in America called modern monetary theory, which basically says the government shouldn't have a budget limit. It should basically spend as much as it needs. And, only inflation will kind of like be the limit of how much they can spend. Look, and that may be a good thing. I'm not here to say whether MMT is good or bad, but there's some moral arguments, I think, why it may actually be interesting. But regardless, it's very good for Bitcoin because it means a lot more dollars created and roughly the same amount of people. Pretty in simple terms, it means the dollar will devalue against Bitcoin in the future. And if you actually look at a chart of the dollar versus Bitcoin, it's this asymptotic line that goes from, there were at one point something like, there were many Bitcoins in a dollar, right, at one point. And now it's like there's $11,000 in a Bitcoin, right? So it's gone the other way over the last 10 years. And because of that, because of this like scarcity piece, I think, again, governments, corporations will want some. So you're finally seeing in America, like corporations start to add Bitcoin to their balance sheet. You're going to see this happen more and more. What's going to end up happening is that, again, people like based on their greed are going to want some, and that's just going to make the whole network more powerful.
Yeah. And is the ultimate intention there that they're then owning a currency which has a level playing field that they don't have control over?
Was that Satoshi's intention in 2008 when he or she wrote the paper? I mean, who knows? It's not clear. And it's not
like what that's the question is like, what was the ultimate vision?
The ultimate vision was buried in the Genesis block. And the first block of the Bitcoin blockchain, there's some text that was added that is the headline of a British newspaper that talks about the chancellor being on the brink of another bailout for banks. Bitcoin is a political act. It is a criticism of the fact that governments can rescue banks, and they do rescue banks as opposed to rescuing the people. So I think where maybe some Bitcoiners would actually agree with the MMT folks is that like the current system is like vampiric. Basically, it's called the Cantillon effect, which was something that a economist from a couple hundred years ago came up with, which is that the closer you are to the money spigot, the more you benefit. These big banks, which are close to the money spigot, they're close to the people who make the money. They benefit first and everybody else benefits later. And it's a very unfair system. Bitcoin's not going to solve inequality. Anyone who says that is lying. However, what Bitcoin does solve is equality of opportunity, meaning that no matter whether you're a billionaire or the poorest person in your country, neither of you can change the rules of Bitcoin and neither of you can stop the other one from using it.
So it takes personal bias out of it ultimately.
Honestly, it takes species bias out of it. It could be a chimpanzee or a smart refrigerator. It has no idea who you are. So it takes any sort of bias out the window. As long as it's a transaction that's valid according to the rules of the system is going through. The point is, just to sort of wrap this, much like democracy, much like the internet, Bitcoin is part of this like weird thing that humans have done where they've unintentionally perhaps as a collective traded off this centralized power structure for something that's like much more decentralized in a way that is self-interested narrowly, but altruistically creates like a better situation for everybody. I think just to tie up some of the threads on it, stuff we talked about in terms of like personal stuff, I think that at the end of the day, some of the things that I've gone through have helped me understand I just need to be a little more like careful and cautious and open-minded. So that's really why I ended up learning about Bitcoin in this way. Open-minded. I was not open-minded. I would have dismissed it. Being open-minded hopefully allows you to understand if somebody is going to be conflict seeking, for example. Hopefully it allows you to choose your words carefully. And it also allows you, in a more general sense, to stop and think and look at something that seems a little strange and dive in. And in Bitcoin's case, that's what we call the rabbit hole. You start to...
Is that the official term?
Yeah, you start to tug on something and you go a little deeper and then you go a little deeper and then all of a sudden you're like way down the rabbit hole. and then you can join the rest of us crazies down.
Yeah, it's the best place.
It's really exhilarating. It feels like it must have felt like in 1991 to be working on the internet. It really is like that. There's this great show called Halt and Catch Fire, one of my favorite all-time shows. And it chronicles a small group of people in the early 80s, mid 80s and early 90s who lived through the advent of the personal computer and the internet. And the zeitgeist of the time was like incredible to be at that forefront, right? And that's what's happening with Bitcoin. I'm sure that like people would say it'd be great to build a time machine and go back to myself one or whatever old and be like, hey, you should really, for your business or your family or for whatever, you should be paying attention to this internet. Because like Bill Gates was going on TV at the time and he's being laughed off the stage by David Letterman and all these other people. What a joke. Guess what? The joke was on that. You have that opportunity now with Bitcoin. Check it out. And you will be laughed at for sure by a lot of people, but you'll be the one who's happy in the end.
What's the best place for people to start? If someone's never looked into it before, they're listening to this podcast, what would be the best?
Yeah, it's tough because Bitcoin is such a bizarre beast. I was part of a project last year where I teamed up with 7 other people from around the world to write a very short explanation of Bitcoin called The Little Bitcoin Book. And that's probably what I would recommend, simply because the reason we did the project and wrote this small book together was because we realized there weren't very many good Bitcoin explainers. So check out The Little Bitcoin Book. We devoted a lot of time and effort to that. And it's a short, little punchy beginning to your journey. Again, this is something that is going to be taught in universities as a 4-year degree and that people will spend their entire life on is Bitcoin. Like it'll be something you get a PhD in.
Is that something that you're championing at Singularity, Alex, at the moment?
At Singularity, I've been giving talks about the power of decentralization, the power of decentralized government, and the futures of money. And I've been talking to people about these different kinds of money that are going to be important in the future. But yeah, Bitcoin's kind of my thing. It's what I focus on the most. So check out the little Bitcoin book. You can follow me on Twitter at Gladstein. I'll give a shout out to the person that helped me understand Bitcoin at the beginning. There's a guy on the internet named Andreas Antonopoulos, and he has a bunch of awesome talks. You should watch them all on YouTube about Bitcoin. He's got a couple books that are like collections of his talks. I think they're called The Internet of Money. So check out him. He'll help you on your journey. But it's definitely a journey. It's
a rabbit hole.
It's not like you can look at this thing carefully and start to understand it and then forget it. It's just going to stick in your craw. So good luck with that.
Love your passion a lot. I want to thank you actually for your work in human rights and moving the world and awakening the world to different systems that allow for more freedom. It's beautiful work. We have one last question, Alex, always that we ask every listener, which is, what does love mean to you? Not necessarily romantic love, like love in general as a state of being. What does that mean to you?
I think for me, love is like comfort and ease and just an escape, a place where you can go, not have to worry. I think that's what love is for me. So that works.
It all works. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening, my friend. If you enjoyed the show, please let us know by leaving a review or sharing the episode with someone you love and expanding this conversation as far and wide as possible. If you're looking for a community to have conversations with about global affairs, please jump in our Telegram group or join our free think tanks. Thanks for being a part of the shift towards a love-based civilization. We'll see you in the Telegram group or in the next episode.